The ground shook before the sound reached me, and that told me everything I needed to know. Something big had already landed on Talvara Outpost, and I was the only one watching it happen. My name is Vesa, and I am Kesserine, though that word means nothing to the people I was sent to study. I had been crouched in the tall grass beyond the outpost fence for 6 days, recording, listening, learning how humans lived so my superiors could decide how quickly they should die. That was the mission. Watch, report, do not interfere. I had followed that rule since the day I left my homeworld. I broke it on the 7th day. The attack came before dawn, faster and messier than any plan I had seen in our war rooms. A splinter group from our own fleet, the Skarn Vanguard, had grown impatient waiting for the full invasion order. They wanted glory before the rest of us arrived to share it. Their landing craft tore through the sky in 3 burning streaks and slammed into the fields outside the outpost wall, and within minutes the human settlement was screaming. I should have retreated. My scanner was still recording, my orders were still to remain hidden, and nothing about this required me to stay. But when I raised my optics toward the outpost gate, I saw him, and I could not make myself leave. He was alone, not surrounded by soldiers, not backed by armor or air support, just one man in a scorched uniform, standing in the gap where the outer gate used to be. Smoke rolled around his legs. Behind him, I could see shapes running deeper into the settlement, women and children and the elderly, herded away by 2 other soldiers who were already wounded and falling behind. He had chosen to stay at the gate so they could go. I did not know his name yet. I only knew what my scanner told me. 1 human, no visible reinforcements, 3 Skarn raiders advancing with weapons drawn. By every rule I had been taught, he was already dead. I settled lower into the grass, close enough that my scanner picked up his breathing, fast and ragged, but steady, in a way that surprised me. Humans were supposed to panic when the odds turned against them. That was in every training file I had studied. Panic, then collapse, then surrender or death. It was one of the reasons my people believed this war would be short. He did not panic. He shifted his weight, dropped low behind an overturned supply crate, and waited. The first Skarn raider rounded the corner too quickly, confident in the easy kill that intelligence reports had promised him, and the man moved before I even understood he had moved. It was not the raw strength I expected from a warrior race. It was timing. It was patience wearing the shape of speed. The Skarn raider stumbled back, disarmed, and retreated toward his companions to regroup. I realized my hands were pressed against the grass, gripping the stems so tightly they had begun to bruise beneath my palms. I did not know why my body had done that without asking my mind first. The 2 remaining Skarn spread apart, moving to flank him from either side of the gate. This was proper tactics. This was what my people trained for, and I expected it to end things quickly. Instead, the man retreated 3 steps, drawing them in through a narrow gap between 2 burning storage huts, and I understood, half a second before it happened, that he had chosen that ground on purpose. The huts collapsed inward from the fire that had already weakened them, and the passage he had lured them into became a trap neither of them expected. It was not cruelty. I want to be honest about that, because it would have been easy for me to see it that way if I had wanted to hate him. It was necessity, and even in the middle of it, he paused to shout something toward the retreating civilians, urging them to keep moving, to not look back. His voice cracked with exhaustion, not triumph. I lifted my scanner and adjusted the audio filter so I could hear him more clearly, and that was my first true mistake, because once I could hear him, I could not stop listening. Almost there, he called out to the wounded soldiers helping the civilians. "Just get them to the transport. I've got this." He did not have it. Not really. I could see the tremor in his hands as he reloaded, the blood soaking through the sleeve of his uniform, the way his knees nearly buckled when he shifted his stance. My scanner's threat assessment flashed a probability of 91% that he would not survive the next engagement. And yet he stood there, between the enemy and the people running behind him, because there was no one else to do it. I had studied 100 hours of human history before this mission. I had watched their old recordings of soldiers and generals, their strange stories about sacrifice, and I had filed all of it under cultural curiosity, nothing more. Sitting in that grass, watching one exhausted man refuse to move from a gate he had no real hope of holding, I understood for the first time that those stories were not exaggerations. They were documentation. More Skarn raiders emerged from the smoke, drawn by the noise, and the numbers against him climbed to 4, then 5. My scanner's probability of his survival dropped further, and something tightened in my chest that had no clear biological explanation. Kesserine physiology does not react this way to the deaths of strangers. We are taught from birth that individual loss is a calculation, not a tragedy. I had believed that my whole life. I believed it a little less with every second I watched him refuse to fall back. He used the terrain again, retreating toward a maintenance trench that ran along the inside of the wall, forcing his attackers into single file where their numbers meant less. It was clever. It was also clearly costing him everything he had left. I watched him press a hand briefly against his side, saw the way his breath caught, and understood that he was more badly hurt than his voice had let on when he called out to the others. Somewhere behind him, in the direction the civilians had gone, an engine roared to life. A transport, preparing to leave. He heard it too. I watched something in his shoulders ease, just slightly, as if a weight he had been carrying had finally been set down. He had done what he came to do. They would escape. He did not run to join them. I do not know if it was duty or stubbornness or something else humans carry that I did not yet have a word for, but he turned back toward the trench, toward the raiders still coming for him, and made himself the reason they would not catch the transport in time. My scanner beeped a soft warning that my proximity to the conflict had crossed an acceptable threshold. I ignored it for the first time in my career. The sun was beginning to rise behind the smoke, turning the whole sky the color of embers, and in that strange orange light I watched a single human stand his ground against odds that should have ended him 3 times over already. I did not know his name. I did not know if he would survive the next hour. I only knew that I could not make myself look away, and that something in me had already decided I did not want to. That was the moment everything about my mission stopped being simple. His name came to me through a broken comm signal, one his own people were shouting across the chaos, desperate and afraid. Daniel Hart. I turned the name over in my mind, the way I might examine an unfamiliar mineral, uncertain why it mattered so much, that I finally had something to call him besides the human at the gate. The trench gave him an advantage for exactly as long as it took the Skarn raiders to realize what he had done. Then they split their approach, sending 2 around the surface while the rest pressed through the narrow channel below, and I understood that his clever ground was about to become a problem instead of a shelter. I should have left then. Every rule I had absorbed since childhood told me that the moment a subject's outcome becomes near certain, continued observation offers no additional intelligence value. I stayed anyway, telling myself it was professional thoroughness, though even then I did not believe it. Daniel pulled back from the trench just before the raiders closed around it, and for a moment I thought his instincts had failed him, that he had walked into the exact trap I feared. Then I saw the small device in his hand, salvaged from the same supply crate he had used earlier, and understood he had planned this retreat as carefully as everything before it. The device released a thick chemical smoke, blinding and disorienting, filling the trench and the space around it in seconds. It was not force for its own sake. It was a door closing before the enemy could walk through it. He used the confusion to put distance between himself and the raiders in the trench, moving low along the wall toward a maintenance ladder that led up to a watchtower overlooking the gate. I watched him climb with one arm barely functioning, hauling himself up rung by rung while smoke curled around his boots and confused shouting rose from below. From the tower, he had a better vantage point than I did, and for the first time since the attack began, he was not simply reacting to what came at him. He was thinking ahead of it. I adjusted my own position slightly, careful to keep my presence concealed, and watched him assess the field the way a skilled tactician might, if any of my own people had ever bothered to respect a human enough to make that comparison. He counted the remaining raiders. He noted the position of the transport, now fully loaded and beginning to pull away in the distance. He noted, too, the two soldiers who had helped the civilians and were now working their way back toward him, weapons raised, faces set with the particular grimness of people who had already accepted they might not get their friend back. He shouted down at them to stop, to keep going instead, to escort the transport the rest of the way to safety. They hesitated, and for a moment I thought they might listen. Then one of them, a woman with short hair and a bandage already wrapped hastily around her forearm, shouted something back that I could not quite make out over the noise, but her tone needed no translation. She was not leaving him. I found myself hoping she would win that argument, and the strangeness of that thought unsettled me more than anything I had witnessed so far. I was not supposed to hope for anything regarding this species. I was supposed to observe and report. The Skarn raiders emerged from the settling smoke below the tower, furious and disoriented, and two of them spotted Daniel's position almost immediately. They began climbing after him, and his high ground, so useful a moment before, became a place with no remaining exit. He did not wait for them to reach the top. He used the height instead, timing his movements with a precision that felt almost impossible given his condition, disabling the ladder mechanism as the first raider climbed, sending him tumbling back down into the others below. It bought seconds, not safety, but seconds were apparently all he needed to keep believing there was still a path forward. The woman with the bandaged arm and her companion arrived at the base of the tower moments later, forcing the remaining raiders to split their attention between the threat above and the threat now behind them. It was not a rescue in the way my training defined the term. It was closer to what old human recordings called covering support, two people risking everything so a third might have half a chance of surviving another few minutes. I watched Daniel descend from the tower once the immediate threat had scattered, moving with the stiff, careful gait of someone whose body had started keeping secrets from him about how badly it was failing. He reached the others, and for one brief moment, the three of them stood together, backs nearly touching, weapons raised outward in a small circle against a battlefield that had not finished with them yet. It should have looked like defeat, three exhausted people surrounded by smoke and wreckage with no clear way out. Instead, watching them, I felt something shift in my understanding of what defeat even meant to this species. They were not waiting for the worst to happen. They were deciding, together, exactly how much ground they intended to give up before this ended, and the answer, as far as I could tell, was none. More Skarn reinforcements arrived from the burning landing site, drawn by the growing chaos, and the numbers tilted further against the three humans standing at the base of that tower. My scanner's probability calculations climbed into territory I had rarely seen outside of training scenarios designed to demonstrate hopeless odds. I found myself staring at those numbers and hoping, for the first time in my career, that they were wrong. Daniel said something to the other two, quiet enough that even my scanner struggled to catch it clearly, but I caught enough. He was describing a plan involving the old storage depot near the outer wall, something about drawing the remaining raiders into one place instead of letting them spread across the settlement. It was a plan built on desperation, the kind that only makes sense once every safer option has already been taken away. The woman argued with him briefly. I could see it in the sharp set of her shoulders, the way she gestured toward his side where dark stains had spread across most of his uniform now. She did not think he could manage what he was suggesting. I found myself agreeing with her and disagreeing with her in the same breath, torn between wanting him to rest and understanding, somehow, that he would not accept any version of safety that meant leaving this fight unfinished. In the end, he won the argument the way I suspected he won most of them, not through force, but through the simple fact that there was no better option left on the table. The three of them moved together toward the depot, drawing the remaining raiders after them like a current pulling debris toward a drain. I moved with them, staying low, staying hidden, and I no longer told myself I was doing it for the mission. The fighting near the depot was chaotic in a way that made it difficult even for my scanner to track precisely, smoke and shouting blurring together into something closer to a storm than a battle. What I could track clearly was Daniel, always near the center of it, always positioning himself between the raiders and his companions whenever things turned against them. At one point, A raider broke through the line entirely, weapon raised toward the woman with the bandaged arm while her attention was elsewhere. I watched Daniel move without hesitation, closing the distance in a way that should not have been possible given how depleted he already was, putting himself directly between her and the danger. I do not know exactly what happened in the next moment. My optics registered motion too fast and too tangled to parse cleanly, smoke rolling across the scene at the worst possible instant. When it cleared, both of them were still standing, and the danger had passed. The woman said something to him, low and urgent, her hand briefly gripping his arm as if to confirm he was actually still there. He nodded, said something back that made her exhale in a way that looked almost like a laugh despite everything, and then they were moving again, because the fight was not over yet. I realized, watching that small, unguarded exchange, that I had stopped thinking of this as information to gather. I had stopped calculating outcomes in the detached way my training demanded. I was simply watching and hoping, and something in my chest kept tightening every time the situation turned the wrong way. The remaining Skarn raiders, seeing their numbers thin and their advantage collapsing, began to fall back toward the wreckage of their landing craft, unwilling to commit fully to a fight that had already cost them more than their commanders had promised it would. It was not a clean outcome. Daniel and the two soldiers beside him were battered and barely upright, and the settlement behind them still smoldered in a dozen places. But the raiders were retreating, and the transport carrying the civilians was already well beyond the range of any further pursuit. Daniel sank down against the side of the depot once the last of the raiders had vanished into the smoke, his weapon lowering slowly, his whole body finally allowed to admit how much this had cost him. The woman crouched beside him, checking the wound at his side with hands that were not quite steady themselves. Her companion kept watch over the field, still alert despite his own injuries, unwilling to let his guard down even now. I stayed hidden in the grass beyond the wall, my scanner still recording out of habit more than intention, and watched the three of them in the aftermath of something that should have ended badly for at least one of them, and somehow had not. I found myself thinking, with a clarity that startled me, that I had never once in all my years of service cared this much whether a person I was studying survived. I had been trained to see humans as a problem to be measured and reported. I had not been trained for whatever this feeling was, watching a wounded, exhausted man manage a quiet laugh at something the woman beside him said, relief and pain tangled together on his face in a way that felt more honest than anything I had studied in 100 hours of recordings. I did not have a word in my own language for what I felt in that moment. I would spend the rest of that day, and long into the night that followed, trying to find one. Night fell over Talvara outpost slowly, the smoke thinning into a haze that turned the stars a dull orange for hours before they finally showed their true color. I remained in the grass beyond the wall, long after the last raider had retreated, long after Daniel and his two companions had been carried inside the settlement by others who arrived once the danger had passed. I told myself I was waiting to confirm the threat had truly ended. That was not the real reason. The real reason was that I could not make myself leave a place where he was. I moved closer once full darkness settled, close enough to see into the makeshift medical tent through a gap in the canvas without exposing myself to the sentries posted nearby. Humans, I had learned, were careless about their perimeter after a battle, exhausted and grieving in ways that made careful vigilance difficult. It made my continued presence easier than it should have been, and I felt an uncomfortable twist of guilt at the thought that his lowered guard was the reason I could keep watching him. Daniel lay on a narrow cot, his side properly treated now, bandages wrapped tight beneath a fresh shirt someone had given him. He was awake, though barely, his eyes half open as he listened to the woman with the bandaged arm, whose name I finally caught from someone passing by outside. Grace. Her companion, the other soldier, was called Oliver, and he sat near the tent entrance keeping watch even now, refusing rest despite his own injuries. I listened to their quiet conversation, my scanner picking up every word clearly in the stillness of the night. They spoke of the people they had saved, counting names, confirming who had made it onto the transport and who had not. They spoke of friends lost earlier in the attack, their voices heavy but steady, Grief handled the way I imagined they handled everything, directly, without pretending it did not hurt. Daniel asked about the settlement, whether the fires had been contained, whether anyone else needed help he could still give despite his condition. Grace told him firmly to stop asking that question, that he had done enough, that it was someone else's turn to carry the weight for a while. He argued, weakly, and lost the argument, the same way he seemed to lose every argument that involved anyone insisting he rest. I found myself smiling at that, an expression I did not know my own face was capable of making until I felt the unfamiliar pull of it. It was strange, watching him now that the immediate danger had passed. In the middle of battle, he had seemed larger than himself, filled with a kind of fierce, focused purpose that made every movement look inevitable. Here, in the quiet aftermath, he simply looked young and tired and human, worried more about people who were no longer in danger than about the pain clearly written across his own face. Both versions of him held the same core, I realized. He simply could not stop caring about people other than himself, whether the moment called for heroics or for something as small as asking after strangers while lying wounded on a cot. Grace eventually left the tent to check on the other injured, and Oliver drifted into a light doze near the entrance, and for a while it was only Daniel, alone with his thoughts in the dim lantern light, and me, hidden just beyond the canvas, unable to look away. He spoke once, quietly, to no one, the way people sometimes do when they believe themselves unheard. He said a name, soft and grieving, someone he had lost earlier in the fighting, a friend whose absence I had not fully understood the weight of until I heard it in his voice. He apologized to that absent friend for something he clearly believed was his fault, though from everything I had witnessed, there had been nothing more he could have done. I felt something ache in my chest at that, sharp and unfamiliar, and I understood in that moment that whatever I felt toward this man had stopped being simple fascination many hours ago. I do not know how long I stayed there watching him drift toward an uneasy sleep, his breathing slowly evening out, his hand loosely curled near the edge of the cot, as if even unconscious, some part of him remained ready to act if needed. I only know that when I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the thought that had been circling at the edges of my mind since the moment on the tower, I whispered it aloud, so quietly that not even my own scanner registered the words as anything more than a breath. I want him to be mine. I did not fully understand what I meant by that. My people do not bond the way humans describe bonding in their stories, the way their old songs and recordings spoke of two lives choosing to become intertwined. I had no framework for the feeling pressing against my chest, only the certainty that it existed, undeniable and inconvenient, and entirely unauthorized by anything in my training. I sat with that thought for a long time in the darkness, turning it over the way I had turned over his name earlier, uncertain what to do with something so foreign to everything I understood about myself. Kesserine do not feel this. We are built for calculation, for distance, for the clean efficiency of observation without attachment. I had been so certain of that fact my entire life that I had never once questioned it, until a single exhausted human refused to abandon strangers to save himself, and something in me broke quietly open in response. The sensible course of action was clear, even through the confusion. I should retreat to my hidden shuttle, transmit my full report to the fleet, and let the invasion proceed as planned, my feelings noted and discarded as an anomaly to be studied later, if at all. Every year of training told me this was the only acceptable path forward. I could not make myself take it. Instead, I found myself imagining what would happen when the true invasion arrived, not the reckless splinter attack of the Skarn vanguard, but the full weight of the Kesser Dominion fleet, methodical and overwhelming, arriving with numbers no small band of defenders could hope to withstand, no matter how clever or determined they were. I imagined Daniel standing at another gate, facing odds that would make tonight look almost gentle by comparison, and something in me refused to accept that outcome as acceptable. I understood, sitting there in the dark beyond the medical tent, that I had already made a decision, even if I had not yet allowed myself to say it plainly. I was not going to file my report the way my superiors expected. I was not going to let this outpost fall the way every projection promised it eventually would. I did not yet know how I would manage such a thing, one scout against an entire war effort, but I knew, with a certainty that startled me more than the feeling itself had, that I intended to try. The lantern in the tent guttered low, and Daniel shifted slightly in his sleep, a small frown crossing his face, as if some remembered danger had followed him even into rest. Without thinking, without any calculation guiding the impulse, I found myself wishing I could ease whatever weighed on him, wishing I could sit beside him the way Grace had, offering the same steady presence he had offered so many others throughout that long, terrible day. I could not do that yet. I was still hidden, still unknown to him, still bound by every rule that insisted I remain unseen. But something had shifted permanently within me, and I understood that the version of myself who had arrived at Talvara Outpost 7 days earlier, patient and detached and utterly certain of her place in the coming war, no longer existed. In her place sat someone new, someone I did not fully recognize yet, someone whose loyalty had quietly, irreversibly shifted toward a single wounded man who did not even know she existed. I stayed until the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, watching him sleep, memorizing the sound of his breathing the way I had once memorized tactical data, and when I finally withdrew into the grass to consider what came next, I carried with me a single fierce, impossible resolve. Whatever it cost me, I was not going to let him face what was coming alone. 3 days passed before I found the courage to show myself, and in those 3 days I learned more about fear than I had in my entire previous career. Not fear of the coming invasion, though that fear lived in me too, constant and cold. This was a different kind, the fear of approaching someone whose good opinion had somehow become more important to me than my own survival. I spent those 3 days close to the outpost, watching the settlement slowly repair itself, watching Daniel regain his strength a little more each day, despite Grace's continued insistence that he was pushing himself too hard. I also spent them working, using every scrap of intelligence I had gathered during my mission to build something useful, a partial map of the Skarn Vanguard's remaining strength, a rough timeline of when I believed the true Kessar Dominion fleet intended to arrive, small fragments of knowledge that might mean the difference between survival and ruin for the people sheltering behind that damaged wall. On the 4th morning, I made my decision. I would not sneak into the settlement under cover of darkness, would not reveal myself in some way designed to minimize risk to myself, while keeping my presence hidden from anyone but Daniel. That felt wrong somehow, a continuation of the same detachment I was trying to leave behind. Instead, I walked toward the outpost gate in daylight, in full view of the sentries, my hands open and empty, my scanner set to broadcast a simple repeating signal in the human communication frequency I had studied for years, but never once used. I am not a threat. I request to speak with the one called Daniel Hart. The reaction was immediate and predictably chaotic. Alarms sounded. Weapons rose. I stood perfectly still in the field beyond the gate, offering no resistance, no defense, while at least 6 sentries trained their sights on me and shouted warnings I did not need translated to understand. My scanner registered a heart rate elevated far beyond anything I had experienced during the actual battle days earlier, and I understood, distantly, that this was what true fear felt like when there was no tactical solution available, only the choice to stand still and hope. It took several long minutes before anyone came to investigate, rather than simply holding position and waiting for orders. When the gate finally opened, it was Grace who emerged first, weapon raised, her expression a careful mixture of caution and barely concealed astonishment at finding an unfamiliar alien standing calmly in an open field instead of hiding, attacking, or fleeing. "Identify yourself," she called out, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from every line of her posture. "My name is Vesa," I said, my translator carrying the words into her language as clearly as I could manage. "I have information about the forces that attacked you, and about a much larger threat that has not yet arrived. I request to speak with Daniel Hart specifically. I mean no harm to anyone here." Grace's eyes narrowed. "You've been watching us." It was not a question, and I did not insult her by pretending otherwise. "Yes, since before the attack, I am Kesserine. My people sent me to observe your settlement before the invasion fleet arrives. I did not intend to interfere." "But you did," she said. "Yes," I admitted. "I did." She studied me for a long moment, weapon still raised, clearly weighing whether my calm honesty was a trick or something rarer. Behind her, more sentries gathered, and I heard someone relaying word deeper into the settlement, spreading news of an alien standing openly at the gate, asking for a man by name. It was perhaps 10 minutes later that Daniel arrived, moving more steadily than I had seen him move since the battle, though I could still detect the careful stiffness in his gait that spoke of injuries not yet fully healed. He stopped beside Grace, studying me with an expression I could not immediately read, caution and curiosity tangled together in equal measure. "You're the one who's been watching us," he said, echoing Grace's earlier accusation, though something in his tone carried less hostility than hers had. "Yes," I said again, finding that honesty, however uncomfortable, felt like the only acceptable path forward now that I had come this far. "I watched the battle at your gate. I watched everything you did that day." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even recognition, though he could not have known why. "Why are you here now? Why come forward at all?" I hesitated, uncertain how much truth I could offer without sounding to human ears entirely irrational. In the end, I decided that half measures would serve no one well, because a much larger force is coming. What attacked you days ago was a small, reckless faction acting ahead of orders. The true invasion fleet will not make the same mistakes. When it arrives, this outpost will not survive without help it does not currently have. And you're offering that help, Daniel said slowly, working through the implications even as he spoke them. "Yes. Why would you betray your own people for us?" The question I had been dreading, the one I did not have a clean answer for, not one that would make sense to him without exposing feelings I barely understood myself. I chose the truest partial answer I could manage, because I watched you stand alone at that gate, certain you would not survive, and refused to abandon people who could not protect themselves. I have never seen anything like that in my entire life. I could not walk away from it, and I cannot walk away from what is coming for you now. Silence stretched between us, tense and uncertain, sentries still watching from the wall, weapons still raised, though I noticed several had lowered slightly as the conversation continued without incident. Daniel studied me for a long moment, and I found myself holding perfectly still, as if stillness itself might convince him of something words could not. "How do we know you're not exactly what you claim not to be?" Grace interjected, still sharp, still guarded. "A scout, gathering information under the guise of helping us. This could be exactly the kind of trick your people would use." "You do not know," I admitted. "I cannot offer you proof beyond my own word, and I understand that my word carries little weight given what my people intend for yours. All I can offer is what I already know, freely, without condition. If it helps you and costs me nothing but suspicion, I will consider that an acceptable trade." I extended the small data device I had prepared, the compiled intelligence I had spent 3 days assembling, and waited. Neither of them moved to take it immediately, and I understood the caution, even respected it. Trust was not something that could be demanded, only earned, slowly, through actions rather than declarations. It was Daniel who finally stepped forward and took the device from my hand, his fingers brushing briefly against mine in the exchange, and I felt something in my chest tighten at even that small, incidental contact. "We'll look at what you've given us," he said. "That doesn't mean we trust you yet." "I understand," I said, and I meant it completely. "I do not expect trust immediately. I only ask for the chance to prove it, if you will allow me to remain nearby." Grace's expression remained skeptical, but she glanced toward Daniel, and something passed between them, an unspoken conversation built on whatever bond had formed during that terrible battle days earlier. Finally, she sighed, lowering her weapon fully for the first time since the confrontation began. "You stay outside the wall," she said. "Under watch. You so much as breathe wrong, and this arrangement ends immediately." "I accept those terms," I said, relief loosening something tight in my chest that I had not fully realized was there. They led me to a small structure just outside the main settlement wall, close enough to be watched constantly, far enough to satisfy their understandable caution. Over the following days, I answered every question they asked, honestly, thoroughly, holding nothing back that might help them prepare for what was coming. I detailed troop movements, weapon capabilities, the political structure of the Kessler Dominion that had sent this invasion in the first place. Anything I believed might give this small, determined settlement even a fraction more of a chance. Daniel visited more often than the others, though I understood that this was likely because he had appointed himself the primary liaison for this strange new arrangement, not because of any deeper reason I dared hope for. We spoke for hours at a time, about tactics, about his people's history, about my own species, subjects I answered as fully as I could while carefully avoiding the one truth I was not yet ready to share. During one of those conversations, several days into this uneasy arrangement, he asked me directly why I had really come forward, pressing past the careful, strategic answer I had given at the gate. "You could have stayed hidden," he said, "reported back to your fleet, let this play out however your people intended. Instead, you're here, risking everything, for people you'd never even met a week ago. That's not a small thing to explain away with strategy." I considered lying, offering some safer justification wrapped in tactical language he might accept without further question. Looking at him, tired but steady, honest in every question he asked me, I found I could not bring myself to offer anything less than the truth, even if I still could not offer all of it. "I watched you choose, again and again, to protect people who could not protect themselves, even when it cost you everything you had left," I said quietly. "My people are not taught to value that kind of choice. I did not know it was possible to admire something so completely until I saw it happen in front of me. I could not simply walk away afterward and pretend I had not been changed by it." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I still could not fully read, though something in it seemed gentler than the wary caution he had shown at our first meeting. "That's a strange reason to risk your whole life," he finally said. "Perhaps," I answered, "but it is the only reason I have, and I find I do not regret it." Something shifted subtly in the space between us after that conversation. Not full trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that might eventually grow into it. I did not tell him the deeper truth pressing against my chest, the words I had whispered to myself alone in the dark days earlier. That confession would have to wait for a moment I was not yet brave enough to create. But as the days passed, and the intelligence I provided proved accurate again and again, I watched the wariness in his expression slowly soften into something closer to genuine partnership, and I allowed myself, cautiously, to hope that partnership might one day become something more. The peace did not last long. 12 days after I walked through that gate, my scanner detected the first unmistakable signs of the true invasion fleet entering the system, and I understood that whatever time we had been given to build trust between us had just run out completely. The sky over Talvara Outpost turned dark long before nightfall, not from clouds, but from the shadow of ships descending in numbers that made the earlier attack look like a minor disturbance by comparison. I stood beside Daniel on the settlement's newly reinforced wall, watching the Kessler Dominion fleet arrive exactly as my scanner had predicted 12 days earlier, and felt the full weight of what I had chosen finally settle onto my shoulders. "That's a lot more than we prepared for," Oliver said grimly, from a few paces away, his eyes fixed on the descending shapes. "It is exactly what I told you to expect," I said, though the confirmation offered no comfort to anyone, least of all myself. "The Skarn vanguard was reckless and small. This is the actual invasion force, organized, patient, and prepared to overwhelm any resistance through sheer numbers rather than clever tactics." Grace's jaw tightened. "Then we need every advantage you can give us, and we need it now." In the days since I had first walked through that gate, I had done everything possible to prepare this settlement for exactly this moment, sharing every detail I knew about Kessler Dominion tactics, weapon systems, chain of command weaknesses, anything that might tilt the coming battle even slightly in their favor. Daniel had absorbed every piece of information with the same focused intensity I had witnessed during the earlier battle, translating my knowledge into practical defensive plans that the rest of the settlement had spent days implementing. It would not be enough. I knew that with a certainty that made my chest ache, and I suspected Daniel knew it too, though neither of us said it aloud as the fleet continued its descent toward the fields beyond the outpost wall. "There's something else," I said, finally allowing the words I had been holding back to surface, because if this was truly the end, I did not want to face it having left anything unsaid. "The fleet commander leading this invasion, his name is Corveth. He values decisive victories witnessed by his own command staff above almost everything else. If we can draw him into a direct confrontation and force a visible retreat, even a small one, it will fracture his authority long enough to delay a full assault while his subordinates second-guess his judgment." Daniel turned to look at me fully, something sharpening in his expression. "You're saying we don't need to win, we need to embarrass him." "Precisely," I said. "It will not end the invasion, but it may buy enough time for reinforcements to reach you, if any are coming." "They are," Grace said quietly. "We sent word days ago, once your intelligence made it clear how serious this was. A relief fleet is already en route. We just need to survive long enough for it to arrive." The plan that followed came together quickly, built from equal parts human ingenuity and my own knowledge of Kessler Dominion command psychology. Daniel would lead a small strike team directly toward the position where Commander Corveth's own vessel was most likely to establish forward command, drawing attention and forcing a response that would pull the invasion's focus away from a full, coordinated assault on the settlement itself. "That's the same play you made against the Vanguard," I said, studying the plan with a mixture of admiration and fear I could not fully separate from each other. "Draw the strongest response toward yourself. Buy time for everyone else." "It worked once," Daniel said simply. "It nearly cost you everything the first time. And it will cost more this time," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "But I'd rather spend what I have left making sure everyone else gets a chance than spend it hiding somewhere safe while they don't." I wanted to argue, wanted to find some clever alternative that did not require him to walk directly toward the most dangerous part of an overwhelming invasion force. But I understood, with a clarity that ached, that this was simply who he was. He would not accept a version of survival built on someone else paying the price in his place. "Then I am coming with you," I said, before I had fully decided to say it. Daniel studied me for a long moment. "This isn't your fight, Vesa." "It became my fight the moment I refused to look away from that gate 12 days ago," I said. "I know Kessler Dominion tactics better than anyone in this settlement. I know how Corveth thinks, how his officers react to unexpected variables. I can help you make this work in ways no one else here can." He held my gaze a moment longer, and something passed between us that felt heavier than the tactical agreement being reached, something neither of us had yet given voice to, but that both of us seemed to understand had been building steadily since that first difficult conversation at the outpost gate. "All right," he finally said. "Stay close." The strike team moved out under cover of the fleet's own chaotic landing procedures, weaving through the disorganized outer perimeter of ships, still establishing position, using the very numbers that made this invasion so dangerous, as cover for a small group moving quickly and quietly toward the heart of it. I guided them past patrol patterns I knew from years of studying Kessler Dominion protocols, past communication blackout zones where early landing procedures left temporary gaps in coverage, buying us precious minutes that would not last long. We reached the perimeter of Commander Corveth's forward position just as full alarm began spreading through the fleet, our presence finally noticed despite every precaution. What followed was chaotic in ways that tested every plan we had built. Kessler soldiers responding with far more discipline than the reckless Vanguard raiders had shown days earlier, forcing Daniel and his small team to rely on speed and precision rather than the improvised cleverness that had carried them through the previous battle. I fought alongside them for the first time, using knowledge rather than force, calling out weaknesses in formation, predicting movements before they happened, translating intercepted communications fast enough to give Daniel's team the split-second advantage they needed at critical moments. It was strange, standing beside him in the middle of danger rather than watching from hidden grass beyond a wall, strange and terrifying and, somewhere beneath the fear, quietly exhilarating in a way I had never expected to feel. We reached Corveth's forward command position just as reinforcements began closing in from multiple directions, and I understood we had perhaps minutes, not hours, before the numbers overwhelmed us completely. Daniel pressed forward anyway, cutting through the remaining resistance with a focused determination that mirrored exactly what I had witnessed 12 days earlier, refusing to let the growing danger slow him even as exhaustion and injury began wearing at his movements again. Commander Corveth himself finally emerged from his command shelter, clearly furious at the disruption, clearly unable to understand how a small group of primitive defenders had managed to breach his forward perimeter so quickly. I stepped forward before Daniel could, using my knowledge of my own people's protocols one final time. "Commander Corveth," I said in our shared language, loudly enough for the surrounding officers to hear clearly. "Your forward position has been breached by a defending force a fraction the size of your own. Your officers are already questioning how this was allowed to happen. If you order a full retreat from this compromised position now, you preserve your authority. If you do not, every soldier here will remember that you stood exposed and unprepared, while lesser numbers embarrassed your command." Corveth's expression twisted with fury, but I watched his eyes flick toward the surrounding officers, watched him calculate, exactly as I had predicted he would, the political cost of continuing to stand in a position that had already been proven vulnerable. Pride warred visibly with practicality, and for one long, terrible moment, I feared I had misjudged him entirely. Then he barked an order, sharp and furious, commanding a full withdrawal from the compromised forward position, retreating toward the safety of the main fleet lines to regroup. It was not victory. It was not even close to victory, but it was exactly the disruption we had needed, buying precious time while the invasion's command structure scrambled to reorganize. Daniel's team fell back immediately, moving fast while the confusion still worked in their favor, and I moved with them, my chest tight with something that felt almost like triumph, despite how much danger still surrounded us. We reached the outpost wall just as the first signs of the promised relief fleet appeared on the horizon, distant but unmistakable, arriving with timing that felt almost too fortunate to be real. The battle that followed over the next several hours was fierce and costly, the Kessler Dominion fleet reorganizing quickly despite the disruption we had caused. But the arrival of reinforcements shifted the balance in ways that made a full, unopposed conquest impossible. By the time the fighting finally settled into an uneasy standoff, with the invasion fleet pulling back to reassess rather than pressing forward into a contested engagement, the settlement still stood, battered but unbroken. I found Daniel afterward, sitting against the same depot wall where I had first watched him rest 12 days earlier. Exhaustion and relief tangled together across his face, in an expression I had come to recognize as uniquely his own. Grace and Oliver were nearby, tending to the wounded, the settlement slowly beginning the long process of counting losses and beginning repairs once again. "We held," Daniel said quietly, as I settled beside him, still hardly believing the words myself. "For now," I said, "the Dominion will regroup. This is not truly over." "No," he agreed, "but we're still here to face whatever comes next. That's more than I expected 12 days ago." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the settlement slowly steady itself in the aftermath of everything that had happened, and I found myself finally ready to say the words I had been carrying since that first quiet night outside the medical tent. "I need to tell you something," I said, "something I have not been honest about, not fully." He turned to look at me, curiosity, and something gentler mixing in his expression. All right. When I first watched you at that gate, alone against odds that should have ended you within minutes, I did not understand what I felt watching you refuse to give up, I said, choosing each word carefully, aware that this confession would either be welcomed or would end whatever fragile connection had grown between us over these difficult days. It was not simple admiration. It became something my own people are not taught to feel at all, something I did not have a name for until I finally admitted it to myself in the dark, alone, watching you sleep after that battle. Vesa, he said quietly, though he did not look away. I told myself, that night, that I wanted you to be mine, I continued, the words finally free after so many days of careful silence. I do not fully understand what that means, not in the way your people mean it, but I know it has not faded, not once, in all the days since. I could not walk away from you then, and I do not wish to walk away from you now, whatever comes next for either of us. Silence stretched between us, and for a long, aching moment I feared I had misjudged everything, had mistaken careful partnership for something deeper that had only ever existed in my own hopeful imagination. Then Daniel reached out, his hand finding mine the way it had once, briefly, at the outpost gate, except this time he did not let go. I think, he said slowly, a tired, genuine warmth finally breaking through the exhaustion on his face. I started feeling something I couldn't quite explain either. Somewhere around the third day you spent answering every hard question we threw at you, without ever once looking like you wanted to leave. Is that a good thing? I asked, uncertain, hopeful in a way that felt entirely new to me. Yeah, he said, a quiet laugh escaping him despite everything the day had cost. I think it might be. Above us, the sky slowly cleared of smoke for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, revealing stars neither of our species had chosen, shared now by circumstance and by choice, over a small, stubborn outpost that had somehow refused to fall. Whatever the Kessler Dominion planned next, whatever battles still waited beyond the horizon, I understood, sitting there with my hand held in his, that I would face every single one of them exactly where I wanted to be. Beside him, not as an observer anymore, but as someone who finally, completely, belonged.